Welcome, everyone, to the very last in a series of 4 incredible conversations exploring African American genealogy in honor of Black History Month. And we're so fortunate that this year, we had the opportunity to partner with the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor, and we have a member of that team and our broader partnership family with us today. So I just want to give Mr. Tendaji Bailey, who I see on screen, an opportunity to just talk a little bit about Corridor and your connection, its connection to the work that IM is doing and why this program is meaningful.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Tendaji Bailey. I bring you greetings here in Horry County. We're at the Horry County Public Library. We have been partnering with the museum in order to facilitate some of these webinars and make them available to some people in person. And so right now we have an audience of community members who are here to celebrate Gullah Geechee Community Day in Conway. We've also had an opportunity to meet in Lincolnville and also in Brunswick, Georgia as well. So we've been taking this conversation all throughout the corridor this month. And so we are so excited to be ending here in Conway. The Gullah Geechee Corridor on behalf of our Executive Director, Victoria Smalls, and our commissioners, we want to say thank you for joining us and thank you again to the museum for including us in the collaboration of this conversation around genealogy. I have learned so much within the past 4 weeks, and I'm looking forward to hearing more of the conversation today and hopefully continue to develop some programming throughout the rest of the year and into the future.
Well, I think we can bank on that. It's a fantastic partnership. And with that, I would like to introduce or offer the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves briefly, and then we are going to hop into the conversation. I will begin with Margaret Seidler.
Thank you so much, Malika. I am Margaret Seidler, and I was born and raised here adjacent to McCleod Plantation. My mother's mother was from a family of working class people in Charleston's east side near the Cook River Bridge. I am retired from a 30-year career in leadership and organization development consulting and training. And my specialties were in helping leaders raise their own self-awareness, as well as group conflict resolution, and also helping multiple groups address polarizing issues. So what I want everyone to know today is that it wasn't until 5 years ago, when I was 65, that I ever got involved in this. Prior to that time, I had absolutely no interest in genealogy or Charleston's history. And boy, has that changed for me. So I thank you, Dr. Matthews and her staff, for having us here today.
And that's a perfect segue to our president and CEO, Dr. Tanya Matthews.
Hello, greetings, everyone. I am Tanya Matthews. As introduced, I have the humbling privilege of being the CEO here at the International African American Museum. I want to give a shout out to all the DMV folks that I saw in the chat. Fort Washington, whoop whoop. Lived there for several of my formative years, and that area is still where my family resides. And my mom's mom, grandmommy, came up from New Orleans during the Great Migration there in the early 40s. And so that is sort of my connection to some of these migration stories. And some of you may know that daddies talk a lot, but sometimes a lot less about their history. And so the family is currently exploring that part of our heritage as well. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited as much to listen to the conversation as I am to be a part of it.
Senator McCleod. You are muted. It happens to me at least once a week.
I am muted. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Senator Mia McCleod. I was born and raised here in South Carolina. I have recently discovered, thanks to the research of my friend, Margaret Seidler, that I am at least an 8th generation South Carolinian. So I am beyond excited and grateful to be with all of you today. One of the things that is so interesting and ironic about my being with you today is that I was actually the International African American Museum's first lobbyist. Before I served a day in the House, in the South Carolina House or the South Carolina Senate, I actually lobbied for the International African American Museum when it was still in the conceptual stage, and was able to enlighten members of the General Assembly at that time about what the museum wanted to do and wanted to become, and how the state could assist them in that effort. And to see all of it come to fruition in this way, and to discover more about my family's ancestry and legacy is just beyond anything that I'm able to articulate. So as I said, I was born and raised here in South Carolina. My family has been in the funeral business here in South Carolina, in Bennettsville, South Carolina, actually, for 109 years. And I'm super proud of that as well. I believe we are one of the oldest African-American funeral homes that is still operating today, and in South Carolina, at least, possibly in the Southeast or in the country, one of the oldest. So lots to be proud of, and I'm super excited to be with all of you today. Can't wait to have this conversation.
And last but certainly not least, one of my favorite people, Dr. Bernard Powers.
Good morning, everyone, and awfully glad to be with you all. So I am Emeritus Professor of History at the College of Charleston, where I taught for about 30 years, teaching courses in American history, African American history, and a little bit of my work focused on teaching about the Black experience in the larger Atlantic world. And today I'm the director of a relatively new program that we have at the college, started in 2018, called the Center for the Study of Slavery in Charleston. And we do a number of things related to what we'll talk about today. I've lived in Charleston for about 30 years. And I just thought about this really this morning, but I've been conducting research on Charleston and South Carolina for about 50 years now. So, and my research began by looking at the experience of African Americans in Charleston, particularly following the Civil War, and looked at the rise of the Black community here, institutional development, and new ways of capitalizing on freedom and defining what that meant. And I've extended that work to other parts of the state, and I have a research project that's been kind of on the back burner now for a while, dealing with the origins and development of Black Methodism in South Carolina. So I've taken the work on Charleston and extended that, as I've had time to other parts of the state. And I hope to move that to the front burner very, very, very soon. And I'm a board member of the International African American Museum, and have been on the board virtually from the inception of the project, and awfully glad to be at this point in the museum's development and to be part of the programming here today. So I appreciate the invitation. Look forward to what we're going to do here this afternoon. Thank all of you all in the audience, the viewing and listening audience, for you all's interest and support for the International African American Museum.
And thank all of you. Today's conversation, as is often the case with any International African American Museum program, is going to be complex, it's going to be rich, it's going to address some areas and topics that are difficult, sometimes even painful, one might say. And in this particular space, we're going to be covering and sharing the research and experiences related to the Charleston slave trade and the business of enslavement, because it was in fact a business. It was in fact a foundational component and dynamic of our early economy for centuries, quite frankly. So if there's ever a moment where you do have a question, where you do have a concern, we're incredibly fortunate to have some fantastic scholars who work with us. Dr. Shelley Murphy is in the chat. She will be taking questions as they are asked. If there are some that are more specific, they will be held towards the end of the conversation. So I just want you to know that while this is a panel discussion, it is also discourse that will involve and will be open and available for our audience to also participate. So just want to make sure that that's clear. So if you have questions, if you have concerns as you're listening, as you're hearing, make sure to use the Q&A function, because that's the easiest way for Dr. Shelley to spot your inquiry. If you place it in the general chat, she might still catch it, but it gets sometimes a little bit tricky because there may be other comments, sometimes some testimony, some sharing that happens more generally and more broadly in the chat. So just wanted to note that distinction. Because this is a webinar, we'll only see our panelists, but we will most certainly hear from all of our attendees via the Q&A and chat. So thank you all again so very much for being with us. And just want to be clear that this is a conversation and it is beginning right now. With a question to you, Margaret. Are you okay if I just used your first name? I should have asked you at the very beginning.
Yes, ma'am. Margaret.
Awesome. How did you first learn about your family's involvement in the Charleston slave trade?
Well, I think that question is really important to set a context for what we're going to talk about today. So I'm going to share my screen. I prepared a few slides that I think will help to explain it. So 5 years ago next month, I revisited a DNA test, and in the DNA test, there was a message that had been sitting there waiting for me for almost a year. And it was from my cousin, Pearlstein Scott Simmons of St. Augustine, Florida. And her niece was managing her site for her. And so I connected with her niece and we talked about why they were reaching out to me. I had no idea I had cousins of African descent until then. And actually, I was pretty excited about it, to be honest. I was really excited. And I thought it was great. And so what Pearlstein's niece asked of me and Pearlstein's family wanted was they wanted for me to research my mother's family's history here in Charleston, because they had a brick wall, I think somewhere around the 1870 census or maybe the close of the Civil War in 1865. And so, as I said, I was never interested in this before, but when you've got somebody who doesn't have that same opportunity, I felt like I really needed to jump at that. And so I went to some records that my grandmother, who lived to be 100 and died in 1983 here in Charleston, had left 2 handwritten pages of notes. And from that, I had an illuminating experience of finding out that I was from a very different family than I had ever believed, and that the truth of my family had been long buried. So what I found was I wasn't from working class people on Charleston's east side, that I had had 100 years of family here before that, and that my family actually came here in 1785. And my 5th great grandfather, his name was John Torrance. His name is down there at the end, Torrance, Gregg, and Pogue. And he came to Charleston. He was from Northern Ireland, but he came via New York City. And he moved to Charleston in 1758 with his bride. And his reason for coming down here was Charleston was such a hot market. He was going to make a lot of money as a merchant. And he became very wealthy. And he also was a transatlantic slave trader. And this is one of about 15 newspaper ads that slavevoyages.org helped me find early in my search 5 years ago. So as I continued my search, I came a generation closer to me, and John Torrance's daughter, Maria Margaret, married a man by the name of William Payne. And William Payne came to Charleston from Southern Ireland, the bottom part of Ireland, in 1786, with a man by the name of Pierce Butler, who was a constitutional signer of the Constitution in 1787. But when I first found out about William Payne as my 4th great grandfather, this is something that popped out, and it was the book Slaves in the Family. And as a Charlestonian, when this book came out in 1998, none of us really knew any of this. This just had never been discussed in Charleston. And so when Edward Ball's book came out, we were all really surprised. Well, I was even more shocked to find out that William Payne was a domestic slave trader, vendue master, auctioneer, whichever commission broker, whichever one you want to call it. And the largest sale that he had ever conducted was for the Ball estate in 1819, where he actually sold, they listed in the ad, 360 Negroes, as they call them. In the ad, it was actually 367. And thanks to Tony Carrier from the museum, she helped me find the invoice from William Payne to the Ball estate, where he made a little over $3,000 in 2 days in 1819. So the value of the 367 enslaved was over $6 million in today's dollars. So I started on this journey, and I've had so much support from the people that are professionals at this, both Bernie Powers, both Dr. Nick Butler at the Charleston County Public Library. They helped me learn how to research newspaper ads. So what I did one entire summer was sit in front of my computer and search online ads for my 4th great grandfather's 30-year career in domestic slave trade from 1800 to 1834. And I've documented through December, I found a few more recently, December of last year, that my 4th great grandfather and his son sold 9,253 local people. These aren't people lost ships. These are people who have, in fact, been living here, creating families here. And they were all offered for sale, either by estate sale, so somebody died, they got in some kind of mortgage debt or some kind of debt, or the city had tax liens against a particular citizen. So I just want to show you a couple of sample ads. I have over 1,100, and I have them all cataloged. This is an ad from 1812, and this is the City of Charleston sheriff. And it says here that the city sheriff's sale will be sold before the store of William Payne and Son on the north side of the Exchange. Of course, that's the Exchange building at the where the Broad Street meets Broad Street meets East Bay Street. And he's got several people that he is actually the agent for the city selling their people. Then I've got one other ad that I wanted to share, and then I'll turn it over to Bernie and let him kind of give you a bigger context on the domestic slave trade. But this was the first one that I found that proved for the first time in all of our living history, all of us, that enslaved people were being sold from inside the buildings on Broad Street, inside commercial buildings that are not museums. These are buildings that today you can go in and do business. And I found many of these. And this is from April of 1828. And so this is a woman and her child, and they can be seen for a few days in the office between 11 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. So I was trying to imagine, well, what did this sale look like? This is a family. What is it? Are they just sitting around in the office with the Payne daddy and his 2 sons? And so I went to Nick Butler at the library, and he goes, "Oh no, Margaret, they would likely have had a holding pen, either in the first floor of the building at 34 Broad Street, which was then known as 28, but it's numbered 34 today." He said they would have a holding pen. It would either be in the building or it would in fact be outside the building. So what I want to say is that if you can you've seen 2 of them, I've seen over 1,100. And these are gut-wrenching ads. These are ads about real people. So that's really, I think, the best context that I can set for what we're going to talk about today.
Thank you for that, Margaret. And Bernie, Dr. Powers, if you could sort of pan that lens out more broadly for us to just give us a sense of this larger context within which the Paynes would have been working in the domestic slave trade here in Charleston, both town and country.
Okay, very good. Thank you. So, good morning again to everyone. So the domestic slave trade developed substantially after the Atlantic slave trade was ended by Congress. And Congress ends it in 1808. And the domestic slave trade that Margaret has referred to will continue until the end of the Civil War, which means until 1865. And by the domestic slave trade, we really mean the trafficking in enslaved human beings within the United States. And as a general phenomenon, the commerce was between the sellers in the upper part of the South and the purchasers in the lower part of the South. And so you can see the upper South here, Virginia, Tennessee, Maryland, and so on, and the lower South where we are, and all the way over down to Louisiana. Now, there were 3 developments that stimulate the domestic slave trade. First of all was the changes in agriculture that were occurring in the upper South in the late 18th century and the early 19th century. And that essentially means that there was a movement away from more labor-intensive crops to less labor-intensive crops in the upper South, Virginia and Maryland, for example, from tobacco to cereal crops like wheat and corn, for example. And there were not nearly as many people required to produce corn or wheat as tobacco. And secondly, there's the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. And the cotton gin was a mechanical device which made it much more efficient to process cotton. And now that you have the cotton gin, it's going to be possible for cotton to be grown in many more places in the South. And that ushers in what comes to be known as the Cotton Kingdom, that huge swath of territory extending south and westward across the South, where cotton was being grown. And it expands dramatically in the 19th century, the antebellum years. You can look on the screen and you'll see the areas where cotton was originally being grown in 1820 in the dark green color, very few places. And look at the light green, and that shows the dramatic expansion and the growth of the Cotton Kingdom by the eve of the Civil War. And there were many places, many central centers of the domestic slave trade. Richmond, Virginia, Memphis, Savannah, Montgomery, Alabama, Mobile, New Orleans, and of course, Charleston. Now, one of the questions that we want to answer today is about how many enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Lower South during this time period. And the answer would be somewhere in the neighborhood of about 700,000 people. But keep this in mind, about twice as many people were sold locally as were sold into the domestic or the interstate slave trade. So that means in the course of the antebellum period, there were about 2 million sales of people. And Charleston was, of course, deeply immersed in the domestic slave trade. In 1859 and 60, about 50 Charleston residents were described as slave merchants. But as Margaret already mentioned, they typically were called brokers or commission agents. And the size of their operations varied considerably. The size could have been very small. In other words, the sale of people could have been a minor part of their business activity, or on the other hand, it could have been their principal work. One of the most important slave traders in the time period that we're looking at is Thomas Norman Gadsden. And Thomas Norman Gadsden was a relative of the revolutionary leader and planter, the slave owner, Christopher Gadsden, who of course owned the property in the late 18th century that the International African American Museum is located on today. Now, the people who were being sold as a part of the domestic slave trade originated as far away as certainly Virginia and Maryland, but a lot of people who were being sold in Charleston originated from in various locations around the state. And some of Charleston's most well-established slave trading operators and agents had representatives in other parts of the state that purchased enslaved people and sent them down to the city, sent them down by the railroad, and also sent them down on boats, on rivers, and along the coast. And while they were in the city of Charleston awaiting to be sold, they were held in private jails and warehouses. And even the city of Charleston offered its jail, the city jail, to house enslaved people while they were awaiting sale. And as a side note, this was another way that the city of Charleston could make money off of the domestic slave trade. Until 1856, you could see the sales of people literally being conducted on the streets of Charleston, on the lower east side of the city, and especially just north of the old Exchange building at the intersection of Broad and East Bay. And in 1856, there was a new municipal law that was passed, and it prohibited these street sales and confined them to warehouses or enclosed yards away from public view. And this is an example of one of those warehouses. During the time period, it was known as Ryan's Mart. Today, this is the Old Slave Mart Museum operated by the city of Charleston, and it focuses on the domestic slave trade. But in the 1850s, it was known as Ryan's Mart. And it's an example of one of these warehouses. Indeed, it was a warehouse complex. And you would have entered into through the iron gates here into what was in effect a showroom where people who were offered for sale were displayed. And then if you walk through the building out into the yard, because the operation and the outbuildings really extended to the next street over, there were buildings, including a 4-story jail. The windows were barred, and all of the rooms where the enslaved people were held had locks on them, and there was a high wall around the yard enclosing the operation. As I said, Charleston was immersed in this commerce, and one way to illustrate this would be to find and look at the ads. Margaret referred to these ads that were routinely placed in the local newspapers. But some of the ads really stood out. So, for example, on January 2nd, 1860, the Charleston Courier contained 38 slave-related ads. 29 of them advertised sales that were underway or were soon to occur. And this represented a total of just over 1,900 people. And I'm sorry that this is a little blurry, but this is a reference to a plantation sale, literally the property, the acreage, and all of the appointments on the land. And I just use that to refer to this. One of the upcoming sales that was advertised in that January ad that I referred to was not only an advertisement placed in the Charleston papers, but it appeared in papers as far away as Mississippi. And it was for the sale of 235 people who were described as a remarkably prime gang and who were being sold from the Pimlico plantation on the Upper Cooper River in Berkeley County in South Carolina, just north of Charleston. And the ad that you're looking at is for the plantation itself, but I'm referring to the people who had worked there. So it took 2 days to complete the sales, which raised about $176,000, or an average of about $750 per person. And some of these people we know were purchased by local traders who undoubtedly resold them later. Now, the traders' activities that Margaret has described and I have described broadly stimulated other businesses and other enterprises, and many other entities earned money on the trade. The railroads provided transportation, the farmers and grocers provided food for enslaved people while they were being held, awaiting the sales. Physicians provided physical examinations and certificates of soundness. Lawyers drew up the purchase contracts, and of course, the banks made loans. So let me just close this out by saying that let me leave you with this final thought. Even though in the situation that I've described, the enslaved person was the most objectified and the most commodified that he or she would be. They often refused to be passive, and they tried to influence what was happening to them by a variety of different means. Some tried to sabotage the sale, or on the other hand, some tried to influence the sale so that they might be purchased by the most benevolent purchaser available at the time. And so this is one of the things that we have to look for. We have to look for that effort mounted by enslaved people, even in this situation, to exercise agency over their lives. And just an example that I'll leave you with, it occurred in 1856, and one of the major slave traders, Z.B. Oakes in Charleston, his agent up in Sumter, South Carolina, complained in a letter that he wrote to Oakes, and he complained about the repeated attempts by enslaved men to try to escape. And then he focused on one man in particular, and he said, "James is cutting up. I could sell him like hotcakes if he would just talk right, but the boy is trying to make himself seem unsound." And so the point is, even in the face of insurmountable odds, enslaved people continually resisted, and by doing so, they reaffirmed their humanity. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Powers, for that broader description that also immediately brought it back to a single individual whose story is representative of this larger idea of these human beings, although property, engaging agency in order to have some degree of control over their lives. And I never cease to be amazed at how incredible the personal story is to the larger collective context. More and more and more, I find myself repeating to the point that it's borderline a refrain that our personal history is our history, it's our collective history. And so I'm curious, Margaret, when thinking about and contemplating this story of yours that is personal, yes, and yet is absolutely a reflection of this larger historical context. What was, I mean, you shared a bit about what your personal reaction was, but this moment in history, this personal family history, is just that. How did family members respond when you shared? Did you share with them? If so, what were their reactions to their ancestors' place in history?
Well, my lifelong cousins that live here in Charleston were all extremely supportive. And I have found a number of people that I grew up with here in Charleston that I went to school with or went to parties with when I was a teenager, and they're my cousins, and I didn't know that. And so they have been extremely supportive. I've only had one white cousin here in Charleston that went silent. And I just feel like everybody gets to make a choice. And neutral is okay for me. I think the biggest support in this entire journey has come from my husband, Bob, who has been there every step of the way. You know, if I saw an ad and I broke down crying, he'd be in there. If we had to drive somewhere for me to go give a talk, he'd drive me. I mean, it's just been a partnership for us. And what has really been so stunning for me is that all my life, I believe that I was from a group of fairly uneducated people. I mean, my grandmother finished the 8th grade and her husband finished the 3rd grade. And to come to find out that I had ancestors graduating from Yale almost 300 years ago. And then just a couple of weeks ago, I found out that one of my ancestors was one of the founders of Princeton University in 1748. And I feel like the rest of my family is like on the journey with me. I mean, that's how I really feel about it. And the thing that is so important about my story, and I really want to make this point, is that what I'm sharing with you all is not theory. This is all fact. This is all source documentation. The genealogists and the historians that have trained me said, you can't tell something you can't prove. And I saw in the chat or somewhere that somebody wants to know if they can get copies of my 28 pages of Excel spreadsheet. I think I've already given it to Dr. Shelley Murphy. They've got it. If not, I'll make sure they have it, because I want to help anybody try and find their ancestors. I think that is extremely important. We are all one family and we got to help each other.
So speaking of that relationality and that spirit of assisting, Senator McCleod, you spoke to this briefly in your introduction, but my understanding is that your relationship with Ms. Seidler began with an email. Can
Yeah.
you tell us a little bit more about that experience and what it means to share history with her?
Sure. Yes. I don't remember. We were trying to remember last night the actual year. Was it last year, Margaret, or was it 2020? It was 2020. I received an email. Well, it wasn't addressed to me. It went to the funeral home, and I handled the communications for our family's funeral home, Mars Funeral Home of Bennettsville, South Carolina. And so when I saw the email, I was a bit taken aback. But I was curious because my dad had always wanted to know more about our family's ancestry, about our lineage. And he was the family historian. And so when we lost him in 2011, I knew that I had to somehow figure out a way to continue to learn about my ancestors and their contributions to the state. I can remember even before I went to law school, a professor at the law school at the University of South Carolina School of Law reached out to my dad, and he came to Columbia to meet with this professor. I can't remember who the professor was, but he was working on some research and had discovered my great-great-grandfather's bio and some things about him. That was Joseph W. Morris. He was a professor at Payne Institute that later became Allen University, and then he became president of Allen University in the late 1800s. And there were just so many things that I learned from my dad. And so on his behalf and on my family's behalf, I reached back out to Margaret, not knowing anything about her, not really understanding why she wanted to talk to any of us. But I told my sister, who runs our funeral home now in Bennettsville, that I was planning to reach back out to Margaret, and I did. And we had the longest, best conversation that day, just with that one phone call. I think we spoke for hours that day, didn't we, Margaret? It was very enlightening. It was a little disturbing, but it was also, I was even more curious after that conversation, and even more committed to learning more about my family. And she had started the process of doing this research and working with a genealogist. And, I wanted to know more because I wanted to be able to share that with my sons. I have two sons, and before my dad passed, he made me promise that I would not stop learning about our family. And that I would take my sons to where he believed my great-great-grandfather is buried. We have some relatives who are buried here in Columbia at Randolph Cemetery. And so he wanted to make sure that I did not forget that. I can remember when he was very sick with cancer, he made me drive him to Randolph Cemetery so that he could show me where their graves were. And it happens to be right across the street from Majeska Simpkins' house. And I told Margaret that Miss Majeska, as I called her, was a very important part of our family. I mean, she was like family to me, because every time my dad came to bring me to USC for school, or to bring me back rather, we would always go to Miss Majeska's house and have conversations that I really didn't know a whole lot about, but just being in the room, you know, I caught so much of it and remembered, surprisingly, I remembered so much of what I had heard them talk about. And so when Margaret shared with me that she was doing this research, I thought, okay, wow, I wonder what she's going to find, and how will that impact us, and what is the depth, I guess, of the connection, and why would she reach out to our family's funeral home? And so, you know, over the course of the next several months, we became really good friends, and we talked often, and she was always eager to share what she had found, what she had learned, what she had discovered, and how she thought at that point that it impacted me, or how it connected with my family. And that was super important, not just because it takes, considering where we are now in terms of the racial tension, and just the courage that I thought it took for her to reach out, not knowing what the response would be, if there would be a response, or, you know, how we would take that. And when she realized that I serve, and she had no way of knowing that because my last name is McCleod and my family's last name is Morris. So on my dad's side, so, you know, she had no way of knowing that. So to discover all of those things during those conversations was, you know, I could tell she was like, oh, wow, okay, well, you know, how are you? She was always asking, how are you feeling about this? And what do you think about, you know, what we've discovered so far? And it just gave me an opportunity to not only see her heart, and I love her, and I consider her family now. She is a part of our family, because had it not been for the research and her willingness to share it, I wouldn't know. I wouldn't, you know, she gave me an opportunity to better understand myself. And that's the way I look at it, because as you said earlier, you know, this is our personal history, yes, but it's also our collective. It's our shared history. And what we do with that knowledge matters, especially now. When I serve in the General Assembly that is currently trying to ban books and history itself. So, you know, just to take all of that into consideration and to digest it as I continue to learn, just speaks volumes about who she is. And it also speaks volumes about what we can make the choice to do, what we can decide to do with the information that is presented to us. So I'm grateful. I am super grateful for her. I'm grateful grateful for her friendship. I consider her my sister. And, you know, those are the things that I hope our viewers will take away from these discussions, because we shouldn't run from them. We should run towards them to better understand not only who we are, but how we fit into the fabric of you know, of our state, and how we are connected and intertwined, interwoven into the, you know, the spirits and the kindredness of all of us. I mean, we are all connected. And I'm just grateful that Margaret helped me better connect to my history and better understand why I move the way I move, and the fact that, you know, what I'm doing is not by chance. It is a part of my DNA, and that's so comforting and so reassuring. So I'm grateful to have made that call back to her.
Can I build
Thank
on
you so
what,
much for sharing.
can I build on what Mia just said? I think that what Mia and I are doing, and we're just starting our public journey. This is our first event, right? You know, I think this is an effective path to conflict resolution to bridge the racial divide and heal. My belief is that white people who have skin color like me, need to acknowledge the truth of our history, which is what my husband Bob and I are devoting our lives to, and take positive actions now. And this quote from Martin Luther King is really the driving force for me. And he once said, "We may all have come over on different ships, but we're all on the same boat now."
So Dr. Matthews, I want to bring you into this conversation a bit to sort of pan out, because here it is, we're having this discussion, this discourse that is incredibly personal. Margaret makes a phone call to Senator McCleod's family business, informing her of something that's incredibly difficult, this reality of an ancestor legally owning another ancestor. And here they are engaging in this discourse, I think quite beautifully, quite bravely. However, to Margaret's point, we're on the same boat now, but we might be in different parts of the boat. We're experiencing different realities when it comes to where we are located on the ship. And I would just love to hear from you in terms of, what do you see the International African American Museum's role in helping to bridge those gaps and engage these incredibly difficult conversations? How are we working to ensure that, yes, there is this conversation of unity, and yet still addressing the difficulty, right, of the transatlantic slave trade, of the domestic slave trade, and its implications on all of our lives?
I think that's a really good question and challenge for us. And one of the things I like to think of as one of the things that museums are, right, is that we are safe spaces for learning in public. Everyone who goes to a museum, there's kind of a good reason you went, because there's something you don't know, and you're going to the museum to find out about it. So you can stand in front of something, a case, an exhibit, a wall, and literally say out loud, never knew that. And it's considered a badge of honor, right? You're considered bold and curious. You're not considered, that it's a shame you didn't know that. And so I think when we're having these difficult conversations about difficult histories, this is a safe place where we can say, I didn't know that. I'm going to find out and dig more. And even as we're looking at, say, we're trying to keep track of the comments and the questions in the chat, you're seeing folks who are openly curious, openly swapping back and forth information around what is notoriously rumored to be an incredibly difficult conversation. And it is a difficult conversation because it's a personal conversation, but at a place like a museum, at a place like the International African American Museum, there's not only permission to have these kinds of conversations, there's an invitation to have this kind of conversation. And I think the impression that many folks are starting to leave with is, I might be missing out on a cousin that I didn't know. I might be missing out on new family. I think that rightly so, human beings have an instinct of protection. And one of the things we most often protect ourselves from is things we don't know. We assume danger. 7 times out of 10, that might be a really good plan when you're walking into those spaces. But if we create a space where you assume that inside of this journey is more self-awareness, more self-knowledge, more sense of being whole, family, connections, missing pieces and answers, I think it's very different. And so one of the things that I really appreciate and continue to hope for the museum is that we literally have conversations like this physically, virtually, hybrid in this space, and can hear about sort of these multiple perspectives and multiple journeys, which will make some folks a little braver, some folks a little more curious, but it creates just a lot more space to have these kinds of conversations.
And this final question goes to the entire panel. So hopefully everyone will take a brief moment to respond, although no pressure. But in your view, because each of you are coming from these very different perspectives, we have a state senator, we have sort of an accidental historian, beginning with your story, right, Ms. Seidler, but then obviously that expanding into so many others' experiences. We have a scholar and a gentleman among us. We have a museum professional that also happens to be, is it a PhD in bioengineering? Is that? So when we think about it, as much as we have in common, there is no monolith here. So from your view, both personal and professional, what steps, again, in your view, do you think can be taken to acknowledge and rectify the harm caused by the slave trade and its legacy? Because we know that it's significant, but some of us but we're all in some way personal representations that there was something else on the other side. And so I'm just curious to hear from each one of you with regard to that. Mia, if you want to get us started, okay.
Because that's a great question and a great segue. I do think that before we can even begin to address, the harm and the sins of the past, we have to be willing to acknowledge them. And what I'm seeing and have seen at the state level is an unwillingness to even acknowledge the truth. And all of these, all of these efforts to ban books on race and enslaved South Carolinians and all of the efforts to ban basically our history and critical race theory. I was so grateful to hear Margaret say that this isn't theory, this is fact. And we should never run away from that. I hope that this discussion will be the first of many that we desperately need to have in the state, because, somebody has to have the courage to speak the truth, whether it offends, whether it discourages. I don't see it as offensive or discouraging. I see it as empowering, because you can't be empowered if you aren't enlightened. And, I think this presents an amazing opportunity to do just that, and to hopefully ignite a movement in that direction for all of us, because I am deeply concerned about the future of our state if we are committed to the opposite, if we are committed to hiding from the sins of the past, hiding from history, not enlightening others about, what transpired. It doesn't change the fact that it happened. It just changes your perspective because you choose not to see it, or you've been forced to not see it and to not understand it. So you're likely to repeat it. We've got to do better. I mean, this is 2023, and I'm hopeful, as I said, that this session today, I'm told that we had well over 1,000 people register, which is really encouraging and exciting to me. I hope that others will look and look at it after it is recorded and hopefully posted later, so that they can understand what's at stake and how they can contribute to the to moving South Carolina forward for all of us collectively. And I'll leave
Thank
it
you
right there. I
so
forgot you said be sure. So I'll leave it right there.
So let me jump in and echo really everything that our state senator has said. I certainly agree with all of those comments, and a few things. Margaret has had a great experience insofar as I know, and insofar as she has said, based on the research that she has done, and she's found great family support for that, which is not always the case, which is not how that always works. And I think she showed Ed Ball's book, and when Ed Ball began to do the research on his family and uncover the slaveholding heritage of that family, and try to get cooperation from his own relatives, he had great difficulty, and people not only discouraged him, but slammed the door in his face in many cases and wanted to read him out of the family. So it's important that we recognize that, yeah, that Margaret's had a good experience in that regard, but it didn't have to work that way, and it doesn't always work that way. As as I've told Margaret, Ed Ball's experience demonstrates that only certain people get to write certain books. Just think if I'd shown up to his relatives and told them about my research plans, how well that would have gone over. But we have to have the bravery to face the facts of the past. We cannot erase those facts, nor can we change them, nor can we ignore them. Claudia Rankin, the Jamaican American poet, would say that the past and history is buried in the cupboards of our flesh. We carry it with us every day. And James Baldwin says that, the power of history is about its ability to explain not so much the past, but what we hope to achieve now in the present and going forward in the future. We stand on history, and it defines who we are today, all of our fears and our expectations. And so we want to be hopeful. We want to be hopeful, but the only way we can be hopeful is to be factual. And back during apartheid, the apartheid era, whites in South Africa didn't do genealogy, and that's not surprising. They could find out that people who appeared white, in fact, were colored, might even be black, and so in apartheid South Africa, white people didn't do genealogy. Now there's no risk in America that the whites are going to have their status downgraded because of something they find out about their past, and so on. But, you know, given the situation that Senator McCleod has described, we not only have to be politically active to serve the interests of our state and all of the people who live here, but we've got to be flexible, and we've got to be creative in thinking about how we can accomplish what needs to be accomplished. Because these things that we're talking about today, we can't just depend on the public schools to teach them, because of this environment that we are involved in. And so we've got to revitalize the lines of communication that we have with community organizations, Boys and Girls Club, the YMCA, YWCA, Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, all of these organizations. It wasn't really until the 1960s and afterwards that racially integrated schools that recognized Black History Week and Black History Month and so on. And organizations like the Association for the Study of African American History and Life got the word out through those kits that they made for decades and decades, and distributed to Black schools and sororities and fraternities and churches. So we're going to have to make sure that those avenues are available to us. And just as Malcolm X would say, and then whites need to do the same thing in their own communities, because we need them to work in their own communities to help to get the word out through the various avenues that they have. So yes, we want to make sure that the public schools do what we finance them to do, but at the same time we have to be operating on this other track that historically has served us very well when we didn't have the other options. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Matthews?
Sure. So I think for me, as I think about how to move forward in this space, a couple of mantras sort of bounce in my head, because the question we get a lot is, you're going to tell the truth, and we got to get the truth out there, and everyone needs to know the truth. And I fully agree with that. And the way I approach that, and I'm mangling a quote that has become sort of a mantra, but love without truth is a lie. Truth without love is brutality, right? So these things gotta go together. So love without truth is a lie. Truth without love is brutality. I grew up in the era of after school specials. All right, 3 o'clock, you get home, you know what's gonna happen. Shenanigans and hijinks begin at 3 o'clock. And by 3:50 p.m., someone is telling the truth about something they tried to hide, but couldn't hide it. And the moral of the story is always the truth will set you free. Tell the truth. Folks will still love you. It might be difficult, but we're going to sort of get past this. And so, I think that this idea of being afraid of the truth is something that has been emphasized in our current reality, but it has never been my lived experience, right? So maybe there's a little pinching, there's a little finagling in that space. And I've had the honor of being able to give tours, preview tours, behind the scene tours, hard hat tours at the International African American Museum to folks you might consider unusual suspects for a tour. Let's just leave it at that. Let's just say tours for unusual suspects. And those tours went well. And I think part of it is not only did people discover something new information that they were fascinated by or curious or maybe even stunned by, but they also unlearned some things. They unlearned that difficult material doesn't mean hostile space, hostile environment. They learned that uncovering even sad and harsh truths are not moments that require yelling and screaming and vitriol. And I think they also discovered how we got through these periods. They discovered that relentlessness and resilience are also about joy. They are also about working and walking together in these really interesting spaces. I'll reiterate something that we said, I think, through this whole session, that this is personal. This is personal. And for me, that means do the work, right? Do your own work. I do agree, that we need to have conversations about holding our school systems accountable, holding our institutions accountable. But at the end of the day, there's no point in banning a book that's already a 3-time New York Times bestseller. If everybody already got the book in the house, that's not really an effective tool sort of in that space. And so while I do agree in these bigger, broader conversations and getting the right thing out there in the book, that doesn't stop people easily from doing their own work, right? From going to a museum, to going to a library, to asking good questions in good environments. And so I think that as we're in this space, all of that is required. And one of the things you want going to a museum to do is to make you want to go to another museum or read a book, right? Success looks like us not answering everything. Success looks like us making you so curious, you're bombarding us with questions like I'm seeing in the chat right now. So I think that's what that looks like. And so as we move in through this kind of space, 2 simple things: be honest and be kind.
So Malika?
Yes, thank you. My
Thank
mute
you.
button did not seem to want to agree
That's
with
all
me. Last but certainly not least.
I know we're talking about books and book bans and things like that, and I just want to let everybody know that the Evening Post Books Company gave me a book contract, and the book will come out next February about the entire process, and it's going to be very special. I can't tell you what's going to make it even more special. Yeah, I hope they don't ban it, but there are 2 other slides that I want to make sure that I show you all, that I think are important about what you do. And this is actually, and this is where Bernie Powers and I are linked at the hip. That's what I think I said the other night when I saw you, Bernie. Based on the research that I did, I got the current owners of the building on Broad Street, because my family had not owned it since 1859, to allow us to install a bronze plaque on their building at 34 Broad Street. And so it was sponsored by Bernie's group, the Center for the Study of Slavery at Charleston, at the College of Charleston. Because what I learned was you couldn't just put a plaque up there. You needed to have somebody who had academic credentials say, we've blessed your research, this is true. And so a friend of mine who's a historian here, that was just a personal friend, said, oh, you should put a picture of what the building looked like in the 1800s, because now there's the facade that looks like it's this colonial building. And so every time my husband Bob and I ride down Broad Street, there are always like scads of people stopping and looking at this ad, because the picture catches people's attention. And the Charleston tour guides have it. I've talked to them, they put it on their tours. Another way that that we did this was the City of Charleston Slave Mart Museum and the Old Exchange Building helped us design this 2-sided rack card. And the Center for the Study of Slavery pays for the printing of that. And so what they do is, since the Slave Mart is just right on the other, around the block from 34 Broad Street, they literally have a talk on this at the old Slave Mart, and then give people the rack card, and they actually walk to the building to see where people were in fact sold. And so down in the bottom right hand corner, it shows my research, and it shows the year of the ads and actually the number of people sold. And in the biggest year, it was 1,118 people. And that wasn't even the same year that the Ball estate was sold. So just imagine William Payne going upstairs to his home on the 2nd floor and saying to his wife, well, hi, honey, I'm home. And she'd go, well, how was your day? it's beyond imagination to me. And then the last thing I want to say about what not only I'm doing, but many of us are doing is a book that came out last February, or this past February, is Ukulele Searching for Healing Truth. And there are 47 of us, and they're essayists and poets that help explore American racism. And so that literally is a picture of me at the book launch, and guess where the book launch was? And no kidding, I didn't plan it. It was at McCleod Plantation, where I was born next door to it 70 years before. So Bernie mentioned ASALA as a really important group to join. There's a really active ASALA group headed by Jerry Harris here in Charleston. And then I'm proud to say that my husband Bob and I have been charter members of this museum for long before I knew my history about my family.
Tindaji, I'm going to go to you, and then I will say before going to you immediately following, we'll be opening up for Q&A. I know that folks have been populating the chat. I will just remind our panelists that there are some questions that are coming directly to you. So if you're comfortable heading into the Q&A and beginning to answer those, that will help to ensure that we're able to get through more questions before we close in about 14 minutes. Tindaji, over to you.
I'm going to be very quick. Just want to say thank you again on behalf of the Gullah Geechee Corridor for this enriching conversation. We are again here at the Horry County Public Library. I do want to turn my camera really quickly, if you all don't mind, just to show the community members here who've been able to participate and listen to the webinar. And so we want to, again, thank you all for being here, and thank you all again for having us. And I hope to facilitate a genealogy discussion following this. So we're going to sign off and say thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. And with that, we are open for questions. I'm turning it over to Dr. Shelley to take us further into this essentially final portion of the program.
Okay, I am off mute. I did want to give Ms. McCleod an opportunity to talk on a few slides she submitted, if you would like to do that.
Sure, that's fine.
And that might even answer some of those questions.
Okay. So yes, the first, this is Larry Coger's book. Larry Coger is the genealogist who was doing the work for Margaret. And it was at a time, well, I learned about him at a time when I was running for governor, and Margaret shared his book with me and some of his findings, and I was blown away. One of the excerpts from the book references my great-great-great-grandfather, John Morris, who, I don't know, do you have the slide for the excerpt that shows that Larry Coger wrote that John Morris, a free Black and a wheelwright of Charleston City, purchased his two daughters, Rosanna and Carolina, from Josiah A. Payne for $300 in 1849. After Morris bought his two girls, he purchased his wife Grace and their son Joseph from William B. for $500 in 1851, rather than the census taker, rather than tell the census taker that his wife and children were slaves. He simply stated that his loved ones were free Blacks. And we later discovered, or it was later discovered, and I learned last year, I believe, that his wife, Grace, my great-great-great-grandmother, was actually purchased from William B. in 1849, I believe. And so there are so many things that I could say about this particular slide, because my dad had not really talked much about my great-great-great-grandfather, but he was raised by my great-grandfather, Joseph H.W. Morris, who founded Morris Funeral Home in Bennettsville in 1914. But I knew a lot more about my great-great-grandfather, Professor Joseph W. Morris, who we always thought, when my dad was alive, we thought he was born free. I participated, thanks to Margaret. I had an opportunity to participate in a webinar that was put on by Larry Koger, the author of that book. And I learned so much about my family's history and legacy. One of the things that I discovered was that they were, my great-great-grandfather was not born free in terms of the way I believed, the way I understood at the time. He was sold to his parents. And Margaret, please correct me if I'm wrong, but he was considered, I can't remember whether the terminology was a nominal slave. I
Yeah.
hadn't heard of it before then. Okay. And he was enslaved by his parents to keep him out of the traditional slave trade. Is my memory serving me correctly with that? Margaret?
Yes, yeah, he got to go to school and everything.
Right. Okay. So, you know, and I was remembering I actually knew my great-grandfather, Joe Morris, and grew up, you know, I knew him from the time I was born. And I can't remember the year he died, but he was 94 years old when he died. And so I had an opportunity to, you know, be around him and get to know him and see him. Of course, he was elderly even then and was sick, had a stroke, and was being cared for by my dad and his daughter Frances. But, you know, just to learn all of the things and try and connect the dots, like his brother, who started Morris Funeral Home in Laurinburg, North Carolina, which is 17 miles away from Bennettsville. My hometown is very close to the North Carolina line. His brother was Coppin Harold Morris, but we called him B. And so as a little girl, I can remember asking my aunt, Frances Morris, why we called him Uncle B, and asking her, you know, was it like Bumblebee? You know, as a child, that was fascinating to me that we called him Uncle B, and it was spelled B-E-E. And so to see this bill of sale in writing, and to know that my great-great-great-grandmother, I don't know if there was a connection in terms of his nickname, but my great-great-great-grandmother was purchased from William B, B-E-E. Just so many similarities. My great-great-grandfather, Professor Joseph Morris, was principal of Payne Institute that later became Allen University. And I'm told that there was no family connection that we know of, or no connection to the Payne name that we know of. But, you know, these are some interesting coincidences, if they are in fact coincidences. So just to know that and to know those things. And I want to reference really quickly the Men of Mark slides. I think the one that's currently up shows that my family lived next door. John Morris, my great-great-great-grandfather, lived next door to Maria Payne Gruber, Margaret's family. And that's from research that she shared with me. So, and that's where we went. Did we go to, I think we have a slide of that too. We went to.
That was on Reed Street.
Okay.
That was the first place
yeah.
we went. Because they
Okay.
lived in the same house or next door to each other.
Right. So this is the Men of Mark slide. And when I was familiar with Men of Mark, I think that was during the time that my dad was alive. That was one of the things that I remember him talking to the professor at the law school at the University of South Carolina about. And, just to see some of the similarities between my grandfather and me. Gives me chills. He was born in August. I was born in August. He was born on August 26th. I was born on August 19th. He graduated from Howard University in June of 1875. And he was elected as one of the commissioners of the Charleston County Public Schools and was nominated to serve in the South Carolina legislature in 1876, but declined both of those opportunities to continue his legal studies. He graduated with distinction from the USC Law School in 1876. And just to know that he was nominated to serve, but declined to pursue to continue his legal studies. Just thinking about the similarities that his great granddaughter would later serve in the South Carolina House of Representatives and also the South Carolina Senate. And when I looked at the fact that he was considered a gifted writer, I love to write, and many have said that I'm a gifted writer. So those are similarities that I never knew about. That he also worked for the Charleston Leader, which was the newspaper in Charleston, and later the Missionary Record. He was, I think I mentioned that he served as president of Allen University, but what I didn't say was when I introduced myself, I was not only the first lobbyist for the International African American Museum, but I was also the first lobbyist for South Carolina's historically Black colleges and universities. And it's just crazy to think that last year, I think we did, what I did for the HBCUs in South Carolina, the private HBCUs, was I wrote the law that helped them get lottery money for those schools. And last year, I think it had already awarded over $104 million to our HBCUs to share equally. So just things like that. It's just amazing to me, the similarities. And who knew that 133 years after him, his great granddaughter would become the first Black woman to run for governor. And when I saw that he led a group of Black Republicans, he was a Republican. He led a group of Black Republicans who endorsed the Democratic candidate for governor against Ben Tillman. And some of his party members had a problem with that. And I butted heads with members of the Democratic Party, and I ran as a Democrat over the years, and recently left the Democratic Party and became an independent. So the similarities are just striking. And I am in awe of just the gift of Margaret sharing that research with me and enlightening me in the ways that this research has. I am forever grateful to her for that. So, yes. So that is the marriage license. I didn't realize until Margaret's research that my family was what family members were married at Mother Emanuel. And this was in 1885. Caroline Harris, let's see, to, I can't remember who the
Henry Fevers.
Henry Fevers. You know, just to see that my family's legacy and goes back so many generations, and the connections to the AME Church. I grew up Baptist, but I knew that my great-great-grandfather was AME, but I didn't understand the connections until Margaret's research. So it's just been super enlightening and super empowering, just to know who I am, why I am the way that I am, and that all of these powerful gifts are part of my DNA. That is something that I will carry with me. I want my sons and my siblings to carry with them forever, because these are really important things to know for us individually and collectively, that we have the courage to overcome. We have the courage to rise above our circumstances. I rely very heavily on that even now, especially now, as we are living in unprecedented times. So, and I will leave it at that, because I know we're pressed for time and I want to get to the questions.
Thank you. I'm going to share that picture, and Malika, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say again, thank you on behalf of the International African American Museum, on behalf of our Center for Family History, for joining us today. Senator McCleod, Ms. Seidler, Dr. Powers, Dr. Tanya Matthews, our president and CEO, and of course, Dr. Shelley Murphy, who was, not to be too colloquial, but as we say where I'm from, was in the cut today. So she was in the background, but is so often driving, moving, moderating, and facilitating these conversations, but always structuring and framing them with such intelligence, such nuance, such dynamism. Thank you. And thank you all. Have a fantastic rest of Saturday. Hopefully, even if it's snowing, it's at least a little sunny where you are. Thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Take good care, everyone.
Thanks for having us.